Welcome to the Association's Futures Podcast, brought to you by Association Activision. We ask you to join us to discuss the future of the Association's community. How can we build and focus on the many futures we will see during these disruptive times? Let's get started with today's guest.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Association Futures Podcast. I'm Michael Butera, your host, and I'm excited to welcome back Tucker Kendall, CAE. Tip has been the executive director of the National Grants Management Association, where in her first 2 years she doubled membership, corporate partnerships, and event attendance. She previously worked as the Director of Membership Services for the National Society of Arboriculture, I hope I said that right, where she managed relations with 69 component organizations, that's a huge number, and oversaw membership services for ISA's 25,000 members. She began her career in the tour and travel industry and later moved into the association world, serving as manager for membership at the National Tour Association in Lexington, Kentucky. She has been a speaker at several ASA events, which I've been the pleasure of being with her. She is also serves on the ASA Young Professionals Committee and the Membership Sections Council and ASCA's Marketing Council, and currently is on the Small Staff Advisory Council. It's a wonder you have any time to do anything. Tip is a graduate of Rogues College in Memphis, Tennessee. An active tennis player and occasional runner, lives outside of Atlanta with her partner and son. Today, we're going to focus on the many challenges that small staff association executives face, with particular emphasis on stress, hers and her teams, as well as the work required to find the necessary resources that small association staffs must contend with. Tip and her team have some incredible accomplishments. Join me in welcoming Tip back to our podcast. Hi, Tip.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for having me today.
Well, it's my pleasure. This whole issue of how we deal with small staffs and how small staff executives have to balance their work is really an interesting subject, and one that I don't think we've spent enough time on in the association community. Small staff executives are often described as nimble, but in reality, isn't that often just a polite way of saying under-resourced and overextended?
Uh, I don't, I think one causes the other. I think the nimbleness is derived from the need to work through challenges. Sometimes those challenges are directly related to our lack of resources. So we are often wearing lots and lots of hats, but I think there's some good in that. Very often we're able to find solutions to problems that other organizations might have the money to throw at, may have a consultant to work on, and we have to find the simplest way forward. But I also say that having come from a very large organization where, getting an e-blast out might be a 5-person effort and might require 5 levels of approval. In a small org, I can get one out in an hour, and so I love that we can be very, very nimble as a small team and require and be more responsive for our members. So I think there's benefit to that nimbleness, but it is often because we are having to do more with less.
So, well, let me ask it another way. What's the truth about small staff leadership that we don't say out loud enough in the association community?
I think I think the thing we don't talk about is that it is hard because you are often in the role of administrator. You are in the role of being a leader and a CEO and a visionary. Sometimes we're not always thought of being those by our boards or our volunteers sometimes. but also, I think one of the things that shocked me most when I came on board was the amount of teaching and real, like hands-on kind of teaching that had to happen at both the volunteer level and at the staff level. And that consumes a lot of time. And so it means I have less time for doing
Yeah, very important point. So let's.
challenging. I do think that behind the scenes, there are a lot of small staff leaders who are talking about burnout and are talking about the daily grind that happens at small staff to try to do everything. And it can be tough.
So let's talk about stress then, and not as a buzzword, but as a structural condition. Where is the stress really come from for small staff executives, boards or members, or is the model itself part of the issue?
Yeah, we were doing one of our Let's Chat conversations recently about managing our workloads and stress, and I asked that exact question, like, where is it coming from? And the answer I got was everywhere. And so it's very hard to pinpoint that, but certainly there are challenges in our governance structure that's front and center. There is no doubt that working with a board that is in committees that are, I always say they're more in the adolescent phase. They're still maybe operational to some extent. They're not quite strategic. And we're, as leaders, sort of working through some of those challenges of when they want to review the light bill, or when they want to, pick the tablecloths, and helping them understand really how to board in a different way. So we're often there in that adolescent phase, of the governance structure. I think that sometimes means there are more volunteers to manage, to be honest, because you have volunteers actually in the operational work and helping to kind of manage some of those programs. So we often have more volunteers, and people don't realize that. And certainly fewer staff to support those volunteers. Uh, and I think some of this is certainly self-imposed. I think folks who rise into the ranks of sitting in the leadership seat usually are pretty independent and self-driven. And so there is an amount of pressure that we put on ourselves, and that's a really normal thing. But I think more than anything is that there's just nowhere for the work to go. When you only have a staff of sometimes one, but we started with six when I started here, and every little question and every little new project or every little new idea becomes, how do I get this done when there's nowhere for the work to go? And that can be kind of death by a thousand cuts when it's
Yeah.
just that cycle of one more thing, one more thing. So yeah, I think, and often boards don't really realize that, or committees don't really realize that there's more mental effort, more physical effort that goes into every new idea or question or change.
Yeah, let me ask that another way then. Those are excellent points. So, at what point does this mission-driven work become a kind of justification for unsustainable expectations?
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act. Sometimes we have to remember that our boards and certainly our members don't understand the limitations of our work. Um, I've worked with lots of boards in the last few years, and I talked to a lot of CEOs. Um, and, sometimes they don't even really understand the work of what a C3 is and what a C6 really
Uh,
is and the limitations around those. I see lots of strategic plans that are overly broad and honestly unreachable, especially considering an organization with we have two staff and $1 million, but we want to lobby the administration. And it's like, that's really tough, and that's happening a lot right now with the change of administration. There's a lot of organizations who are like, we should get into advocacy. And it's like, well, you have a $1 million budget. That's not going to go very far. But they don't even understand that. And so it can be challenging, but I think what's really important for associations, and when I talk to leaders, we talk a lot about keeping that very narrowed focus. That really serves you well in the long term. be really excellent at doing just a few things. What is it? I think Jim Collins says in Good to Great, if you have more than three priorities, then you have none.
None.
And that's I see that a lot where we want to try to fix every challenge of our members, but it's not always the right time and it's not always we don't always have the resources to do it right now. So if you really just focus in on three really good things that you can do exceptionally well, that is great. And kind of watering down your organization in the pursuit of those goals that can't really be achieved and you can't ever reach those expectations doesn't serve the organization in the long term.
So let me try one more way. This is really a tough question, maybe unfair, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How many small staff associations are one resignation, one crisis away from operational crisis beyond reach?
I can't put a number on it, but I think it's more than you think. I've seen a few examples just in recent years, and of course, a lot of what we think is about 90% of associations are considered small associations, and so the bulk of associations out there are just a few people on staff. And one of the things we do really poorly is succession planning.
Uh,
And it should be front and center of every small staff. It's just part of our risk management and to have no plan for the departure of your key staff leader is a problem. It's a hard lesson to wake up one day as a board member and find out that the passwords to everything is on a single laptop and no one knows that password and no one's on the bank account. But it happens all the time. It really does. Um, I think as humans, we don't like to think about the worst case scenarios. And that's a big part of our job as leaders when we sit in the seat, but also our board members. But certainly when talking about burnout, there's a lot of leaders out there who are thinking, I don't know how long I can do this. The pace is so fast. How long can I keep this up? And is there a plan for me to depart? Um, and it's happening. I don't think we have those hard conversations enough, however.
yeah, when you consider, your colleague executive directors, both in small and larger organizations, how does the role of the executive director fundamentally change when you don't have those layers of staff to rely on?
Well, I mean, there are certainly good things. Uh, for me, when we were a team of six, I understood my staff very well. I worked with all of them on a very close level. So I knew their weaknesses and their superpowers and really how they could fit into the greater structure of our team. And so I think there's a lot of really wonderful things. But it also means that again, there's nowhere else for work to go sometimes. And as ED, I tend to take that on. And it also means when I'm really honest, I'm talking to folks about what it means to be a small staff ED. It means I do a lot of work that I don't love. Um, there's a saying that you should eat your frog every morning. Your frog is that one thing that you don't want to do because you're not good at it, or it's going to be a hard conversation, or it's just something that you dread. And I have a lot of frogs. It's a lot of frogs in my world. But I've learned to sort of make peace with those because there's a lot of good parts about my job as well. Um, but I think for EDs, you really have to be in a consistent learning mode because I can't possibly be good at everything in my job. I can't be an HR expert and an accounting expert and a membership expert and a meetings expert. I have to know enough to sort of manage through that. Um, but I have to constantly be learning and trying to get better at everything all the time. And I think that's part of that pressure too that we talked about earlier.
Is it reasonable to expect strategic thinking from leaders who are so burdened with execution every day?
I think it's reasonable, but it's harder. Um, one of my favorite pieces of advice recently. I was with a group of CEOs and we were talking about contracts and what's your favorite thing that you've written into your contract for some of those who have already been through multiple levels of contract review and re-signing. And someone said, I always write in that I get a paid 1 week sabbatical just to focus on the business. And I thought, that sounds like a paid vacation to me. Um, and then last year I had this weird moment where I had two meetings in DC and it was made no sense for me to go home and come back. And so I ended up spending a long weekend in DC by myself, just thinking about the business, thinking about some upcoming governance changes, um, thinking about me as a leader, reading a business book about leadership. And it was one of the most profound things I have done. And so now that is part of my yearly planning is that I know that I need to take time away to think about the business in a much broader sense, at a much higher level, because it is so constant in the day to day that it's very, very challenging to do that. And so I plan time for me to do that. And I also plan time for me and my chair and vice chair to spend some time just doing that, talking about the business in a broad sense and where we think the next year to 3 years to 5 years might go and and not get mired in the what's on the agenda this week kind of
So,
thing.
let's work on challenging one of those core assumptions about small staff associations. Are small staff associations under-resourced, or are they structured in a way that makes resource scarcity inevitable?
Well, first, I think we have to remind ourselves that there are a lot of really well-funded small associations. I talked to quite a few CEOs. They have big budgets, but they just spend money differently. And so I think it's a reminder that we're not all the same and in the same boat around what our financials are. Um, but I do think that our structure is a lot of the issue. There are things that we could do a lot better. We have a tendency to, again, we're not always experts at everything. And so I think we make some big mistakes in terms of maybe over purchasing tech and thinking that there are silver bullets to our ability to do more. Um, Again, I think our boards are in an interesting spot, usually not all the time. Again, there are some really great boards. I have a really wonderful board who's made that journey into being a strategic board. And there are lots of them out there, but most of the ones I talk to are still very much in that push and pull stage of bringing their boards along. I think more than anything, one of the challenges we have is around that growth of the leader from being an administrator, project manager, sometimes event planner, and that's how they're perceived by the board, and then moving them into a place where they're actually in that kind of CEO role where they're pulling the organization along, they're determining culture, they're determining um, they're able to be that strategic thinker. And yeah, I think part of that is just built into the small staff tension that happens. Um, and the way to deal with that is to be very aware of it and talk about it and think about where are we moving towards and how are we getting there versus being mired in the problem of the day to day.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was, staying focused on two or three really important things, which I thought was an excellent point. Well, how do you decide what not to do when everything feels so mission critical to everybody else?
I think there's a lot of things at play. I think one of the first mistakes we make is not bringing the right information to the table for decision making. I can't say enough to small staff leaders about programmatic budgets, factoring in staff time, so that our boards have clear understanding about what our most beneficial programs are, particularly around, what's revenue producing and what's revenue sucking. I think that's critical to understanding. We do a lot of things because they're nice. We don't always talk about what produces money and what does not. And we run a business, and keeping that mindset of this is a business, we would not be doing all of the things for no money. We have to focus on where our money comes in and out.
So,
Internally, I'm
oh,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were booming
Yeah.
along. Go right for it.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot internally, and that was when I came on board, sort of the initial conversation I had with my staff, which was about maximizing our time. Right now we have 7,500 members and 10 staff. And so we simply cannot afford to do programs that affect 20 and 50 people. We have to build things that create maximum value for as many members as possible. So it's important that our board understand that a program, no matter how beloved it might be, and sometimes there's a lot of emotions around our programs in our nonprofit space, but if it only touches a few people, that time and effort is not well spent. And so we really have to think about, again, we're in that constant cycle of evaluation, deciding if there's room for investment, for improvement, or if it's time for sunsetting. And so I think that's an important thing that we have to do. I actually have a specific lens that I talk to my staff about and ask them to look at their work. And that's aside from our like normal programs, our big, like our annual meeting and that sort of thing. Does this program create revenue or does it create substantial value? And I mean, again, broadly, not for 20 people, but for a large group. And it comes down to even, how are we spending our day-to-day time? Are we doing things that create value or create revenue, preferably both if they can? But it just gives them a lens for what am I looking at? Why are we working on this project that doesn't have great impact when we could be spending our time and effort working on something that really creates real change in our membership and our profession?
Are you seeing any creative approaches to resource development that actually work? Not theory, but some real examples?
That's a tough one. I don't actually have an answer for that. I
That's
think,
okay.
yeah, I don't necessarily have a silver bullet for that. I think sometimes small staffs chase, and I think all associations chase uh, resources that are not always core benefits. And they're looking for a lot of non-dues revenue without really thinking about, again, the time spent to manage those programs and the value that they really add, and they don't measure them. And so I've worked on a lot of programs where we had, say, we had, rental car discounts, and we had a variety of really nice programs that weren't actually high value. And so I think it's really important to come back to those questions. Does it create revenue? Does it create value? Is the time spent appropriate? I think, again, for me, I think small staff lens has to be about how are we maximize every dollar and every hour of our staff time.
So that's an excellent point, by the way. Let's bring the board into this conversation for a few minutes. How often are boards truly aligned with the realities of small staff capacity?
I think, there, I don't, again, I can't give you a number. I think there are, and I also think that over the long haul, not you can't take this year's board with next year's board. They
Mhm.
change. Certainly who's sitting at the top changes a lot, but I think that they often understand that there are limited resources, but they don't actually live in the world. And sometimes too, I see leaders who don't tell their story well. And I think that's the greater mistake. I've certainly talked to leaders who are like, my board just doesn't understand how busy I am. And then they're like, then they want me to do a report on what I'm doing. And I'm not a lover of, executive director checklist reports, but I am a fan of telling your story. If they don't understand why what is on the ED's plate and what value you contribute to the organization, they're going to assume that there's lots of space and time to do new things. So I think some of that is that managing up and telling our story well. I think we as leaders don't want to appear weak or that we're not as capable as we want to be seen. So we don't raise our hand sometime and have that conversation, say, hey, we've added 4 new projects this year and we didn't add any staff. We're going to need to talk about what we cut. But
Yeah.
those are the conversations that we get paid to have. And
Right.
so we need to be doing a lot more of that.
So one other question along the line of governance. So is this traditional governance model that's been around for 100 years, uh, is it part of the problem?
I, yes, but I think you and I have probably chatted enough to know that I'm also a big fan of our governance
Right.
model. I think there are many wonderful things about it, but I think at the end of the day, it's an unusual model, right? Because I am in business as a partner with 12 people that I didn't choose. Uh, that's an odd thing. And in that is a process of developing trust and credibility and designing the future for the business together. And it's not an easy thing. And I don't think it's meant to be easy. So I think, yes, that is certainly built into that. I think the other part is that all of us are have boards who come with different perspectives. I'm very lucky. My grants managers understand something about risk and a little bit about budgeting and accounting, but I certainly have worked for organizations where those are foreign ideas. It's just not something that, say, an arborist does. And so you are again, trying to run a business with someone who doesn't necessarily have the business knowledge coming in to the board. And then you have to remind yourself that part of this journey is that in the course of their leadership experience, they need to learn those skills. And that's my job is to put them in a position to learn how to lead a business and how to really look at the financials and how to look at risk and have those discussions so that we can make the organization better.
We can't have this conversation without talking about technology. And again, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, so I want to explore that just in a pinch more detail. So there's a lot of talk about AI and all these new technologies as being solutions. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, is technology actually reducing burden or just shifting it around? Or is it an illusion of relief that doesn't really come to play?
I think it's all of the above. And I think that happens with every tech change. I mean, I remember I'm old enough to remember like when websites were a new thing and it was like, did we get a website? This seems like more work, but also maybe we have one, maybe we don't. I think we're still very much in that place, particularly for small staffs. We don't have high budgets. So I can't hire a consultant to go and, design our AI strategy. So I do think I have experienced AI to be a time saver for a lot of things. Um, However, I think most small staffs are just looking at dipping their toe in the water and trying to understand where the technology is going so that we don't expend our member resources and our staff time in a way that isn't fruitful. So I think a conservative approach is what I'm seeing generally. I do think it's gonna benefit us generally moving into the future. But it's hard when you're the leader, and I don't have a tech staff or staff. I don't have anyone I can go to kind of figure this out. So I think the hard thing is, as a leader, I feel the pressure to train my staff, to figure out what is the appropriate direction to go with this technology, to figure out how it can benefit our members' experience, um, and then actually implement it. It's all on me. It's not on anyone else. And I think that's for most of the small staff leaders I talk to, they're like, I'm just overwhelmed with adding this to my plate. And so our approach has been to keep it very basic, a very basic AI policy that protects our intellectual property. Obviously, that's front and center because that's around our risk management to give our staff some leverage to or some opportunity to explore how AI can help them, but also some very limited boundaries around what is appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of marketing copy and that sort of thing. And so again, I think it comes down to having conversations about where you're at and just kind of knowing that AI is coming and we're going to need to keep having that conversation on into the future until we're ready to, I don't think it's going to end, to be honest. I think we've got a long haul with AI development, but it's going to be something that evolves as the technology evolves and our ability to embrace it evolves.
So among tough questions, here's another one for you. If you were advising small staff executive directors who feel totally overwhelmed at the moment, what are the first few things you would tell them to stop doing?
I would start by telling them to take less time on low risk decisions. I think that is one of the hardest things that we do, but most important things that we do is to quickly evaluate decisions. Is this low risk? Is this high risk? What is really going to be the ripple effects of this? And then we move through the low risk decisions quickly. I think you don't have skills at that. You need to get better at it. I think a little bit about what we talked about. We have a mechanism to stop doing tasks and projects that don't create substantial value. Because again, my role is protecting my staff's time and energy and joy. I think there's the other thing is my staff doesn't need to be mired in low value projects that are not going to make them feel good about coming to work. They're already wearing 12 hats. So if I'm asking them to do a lot of menial work that really doesn't create change, that's not fun for them. So I need to protect them as much as possible.
So,
I think,
no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean
oh,
to
go ahead.
interrupt you again. The delay here is one of those things I have to learn to deal with. Hey, when you think about the future small staff associations, are you optimistic, or do you believe we are headed toward a lot of unnecessary disruption?
Oh, Michael, I think there's always disruption. I think that's part of our job is to figure out how to move through disruption. So yeah, I certainly think the next little bit, well, the last year has been quite a disruption, but I think there's going to be more disruption. Um, I, again, sitting in the seat, I think small staff leaders have to have the confidence that they can navigate that and that they are constantly kind of weeding I always say you need to treat your association like a garden. We lay the good foundations of our soil. We are good governance structure, having good, honest conversations, great staff structure, culture building, all those things that we work at every single day to lay a foundation that we can start to grow our projects in a way that really help our organization. So I think on the whole, when I talk to small staff leaders, they're excited about what they can build and how they can really affect change. And if you're not, I would be very concerned because that is part of your job. I have to remember that I bring to the table, um, excitement about our work. I have to mirror that for my staff. I have to be curious about my membership. I have to be analytical about our projects and look at them with a really tough lens. And I want my staff to do that. And if I'm not bringing that to the table, then how can I really expect them to? So, yeah, I'm very optimistic.
That's great to hear. It really is. So as we wrap up here, Tip, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing your time with me today because we just talked about how tight it really is. If someone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Well, definitely find me. LinkedIn is obviously the easiest place. But yeah, they're welcome to email me, tip@ngma.org. But yeah, LinkedIn is the place, I think, isn't it the place for everyone these days in the association space to connect. But yeah, happy to talk about small staffs all day because I think we need as much support as possible and we need to lean on each other. And I'm very grateful that when I started this role, I had a core group of other CEOs who had just come before me and had tackled a lot of problems. And I called them and said, "Can I get a template? Can you help me work through a problem?" And if you're a small staff leader, you need to reach out and you need to kind of have that support system to help you work through those initial challenges. It makes those first 2 or 3 years much more manageable. And so support is critical.
Well, I want to thank you again for sharing your wonderful ideas and thoughts about a very powerful subject, which is what we do in the Small Staff Association leadership roles. As we close today's conversation, folks, I want to bring us back to something powerful that I learned today. Small staff does not mean small impact, but it does not mean infinite capacity. So the tip, no pun intended today, that we helped illuminate today is something many leaders live, but not always name. Small staff associations are not struggling because they lack commitment. They're not falling short because they lack talent. They are operating inside systems that really were never designed for the realities that we face today. And that's a big shift that we have to make. So small staffs are, from my perspective, mighty by design. And that's what TIP has illuminated for us here today. It's not about building capacity where it counts. It's about aligning governance, resources, and expectations with realities. And that's about having the courage to stop doing what no longer serves the mission. Here's the truth. You cannot be mighty by accident. You cannot be strategic by exhaustion. You can become mighty by design. That means making hard decisions. That means saying no once in a while. That means redefining success, not by volume, but by value and impact. Those three central focus issues that Tip related to us. For small staff leaders, that may be the most important leadership work of all. I'm Michael Butera, and this is Association Futures Podcast. Let's keep building intentionally, courageously, and yes, let's in the small world be mighty by design. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.